Philosophy 101. From Plato and Socrates to Ethics and Metaphysics by Paul Kleinman, 2013. Part 1. The Foundations of Western Philosophy. You begin your journey into philosophy by meeting its first great martyr, Socrates, a man who never wrote a single word, but whose ideas have echoed through 25 centuries. Socrates walked the streets of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in conversations that exposed the limits of their knowledge, using a method of questioning that became known as the Socratic method. He claimed to know nothing, which made him wiser than those who thought they knew everything, and his relentless pursuit of truth eventually led to his trial and execution for corrupting the youth and impiety. You learn that Socrates chose to drink hemlock rather than abandon his philosophical mission, and his death became philosophy's founding story, the moment when the commitment to truth became more important than life itself. The Socratic method you will encounter throughout your life, in law schools and classrooms, traces directly back to this stubborn, barefoot man who insisted that the unexamined life is not worth living. You now meet Plato, Socrates' most famous student, who transformed his teacher's spoken words into written philosophy that would shape the entire Western tradition. Plato founded the Academy in Athens, the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, and his dialogues feature Socrates as the main character, questioning everything and everyone. You discover Plato's theory of forms, his most famous and influential idea, which argues that the world you experience through your senses is merely a shadow of a higher reality. The physical chair you sit on is just an imperfect copy of the perfect eternal form of chair that exists in a realm beyond space and time. You grapple with the allegory of the cave, Plato's powerful image of prisoners chained in darkness who mistake shadows on the wall for reality. When one prisoner escapes and sees the sun, he cannot bear to return to the cave and its illusions. Plato is asking you to consider whether your own reality might be shadows, whether there is a sun you have not yet seen, and whether you would have the courage to seek it. You turn to Aristotle, Plato's greatest student, who rejected his teacher's theory of forms while building a philosophical system that would dominate Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. Where Plato looked to another world for truth, Aristotle insisted that you must study this world, observing and categorizing everything from biology to politics to poetry. You learn that Aristotle invented logic as a formal discipline, giving you the syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. You explore his concept of the golden mean, the idea that virtue lies between extremes. Courage is the mean between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and extravagance. Aristotle tutored Alexander the Great and founded the Lyceum, but his greatest gift to you is the understanding that philosophy is not just abstract speculation, but a practical guide to living well and flourishing as a human being. You move into the Hellenistic period, where philosophy becomes less about cosmic speculation and more about how to live in a world that feels increasingly chaotic. The Stoics, led by Zeno, Epictetus, and the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, teach you that you cannot control what happens to you, but you can absolutely control how you respond. Epictetus, born a slave, developed a philosophy of radical acceptance. Some things are unto you, others are not, and your peace depends on knowing the difference. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations not for publication, but as personal reminders to himself to remain virtuous, calm, and focused on what matters. Meanwhile, the Epicureans offer a different path. Pleasure is the highest good, but Epicurus meant something quite different from what you might assume. True pleasure for Epicurus is the absence of pain and disturbance, a simple life, good friends, and freedom from fear, especially the fear of death, which he argued should not trouble you, because when death is present, you are not. Part 2. Medieval and Renaissance Philosophy. You enter a millennium where philosophy becomes the handmaiden of theology, as thinkers struggle to reconcile Greek reason with Christian faith. St. Augustine, a former pagan who converted to Christianity, draws deeply on Plato to understand God, the soul, and the problem of evil. You grapple with Augustine's question: if God is all-powerful and all-good, why does evil exist? His answer, that evil is not a thing but the absence of good, the privation of what should be there, shapes Christian thought for centuries. Augustine also gives you his Confessions, the first great autobiography in Western literature, in which he examines his own life with ruthless honesty, asking how a human soul finds rest except in God. You come to see that for Augustine, philosophy is not just intellectual exercise, but the soul's journey toward its true home. You meet Boethius, a Roman statesman imprisoned and awaiting execution, who writes the Consolation of Philosophy while in his cell. Philosophy appears to him as a beautiful woman who reminds him that worldly fortune is fickle and that true happiness comes only from what cannot be taken away. You learn that Boethius grapples with the problem of free will and God's foreknowledge. If God knows everything you will do, how can your choices be free? His resolution that God's eternal perspective sees all time at once without causing your choices becomes a classic solution to this enduring puzzle. As you read Boethius, you realize he is writing not abstract theory, but words to sustain himself through the worst moment of his life: philosophy as comfort and companion in the face of death. You now encounter Thomas Aquinas, the giant of medieval philosophy, who attempts the audacious task of synthesizing Aristotle with Christian theology. Aquinas writes his Summa Theologica as a textbook for beginners, organizing knowledge into questions and objections that mirror the actual process of thinking. You learn his famous 5 ways to prove God's existence: from motion, from causation, from contingency, from degrees of perfection, and from design. But more important than any individual argument is Aquinas' conviction that reason and faith cannot ultimately conflict, because both come from the same God. You see him carefully distinguishing what can be known through philosophy from what must be revealed through Scripture, building a cathedral of thought that attempts to honor both Athens and Jerusalem. You move into the Renaissance, where philosophy rediscovers the human after centuries of focus on the divine. Pico della Mirandola writes his oration on the dignity of man, which you might think of as the manifesto of Renaissance humanism. Pico imagines God telling Adam that he has been given no fixed form or function, so that he might choose for himself what to become. You learn that for the Renaissance thinkers, human beings are not just fallen creatures awaiting salvation, but miraculous beings capable of shaping their own destiny. Niccolò Machiavelli writes The Prince, a book so shocking that his name becomes synonymous with evil, but you are asked to understand it in context. Machiavelli is not telling princes to be evil for its own sake. He is describing politics as it actually is, not as you might wish it to be, and arguing that effective leaders must sometimes do terrible things to maintain order and security. Part 3. Modern Philosophy, Reason and Revolution. You arrive at the dawn of modern philosophy with René Descartes, a man who decides to doubt everything that can possibly be doubted in order to find something certain. Descartes sits alone in a stove-heated room, questioning whether his senses can be trusted, whether he might be dreaming, whether an evil demon might be deceiving him about everything. You follow him through this radical doubt until he arrives at his famous conclusion: I think, therefore I am. Even if he is being deceived, there must be something that is being deceived, and that something is his thinking self. From this one indubitable foundation, Descartes attempts to rebuild all human knowledge, proving the existence of God and the external world through logical argument. You are left with a new picture of the human being as essentially a thinking thing, a mind somehow connected to a body, and with a new problem: how do these two completely different substances interact? You meet John Locke, who rejects the idea of innate knowledge and argues that the mind at birth is a blank slate, a tabula rasa, upon which experience writes. Locke is an empiricist, believing that all your ideas come from sensation and reflection, and he applies this approach to politics as well as knowledge. You learn about natural rights, life, liberty, and property that belong to you simply because you are human, not because any government grants them. Governments exist, Locke argues, to protect these rights, and if they fail to do so, you have the right to overthrow them. You realize that Locke's ideas will echo through the American Declaration of Independence, through revolutions, through the very structure of modern democratic thought. He gives you a vision of knowledge based on experience and politics based on consent, a world where authority must justify itself rather than simply being accepted. You now encounter David Hume, the Scottish philosopher who pushes empiricism to its skeptical conclusions. Hume argues that you have no good reason to believe in cause and effect. You only ever see one event following another, never the necessary connection between them. You believe the sun will rise tomorrow only because it always has, but this is habit, not logic. Hume extends his skepticism to the self, arguing that when you look inside yourself, you never find a stable self, but only a bundle of perceptions constantly changing. He even critiques miracles and religion, arguing that it is always more likely that someone is mistaken or lying than that the laws of nature have been violated. Hume leaves you with a profound challenge. Much of what you think you know rests not on reason, but on custom and feeling, and you must learn to live with this uncertainty. You meet Immanuel Kant, awakened from his dogmatic slumbers by reading Hume, who attempts to save knowledge from skepticism while respecting Hume's insights. Kant argues that the mind is not a blank slate, but actively structures experience using categories like space, time, and causality. You never experience the world as it is in itself, the noumenal realm. You only experience the world as it appears to you, the phenomenal realm, shaped by the structures of your own mind. This is Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy. Just as Copernicus showed that the earth moves around the sun, Kant shows that the mind shapes reality rather than merely reflecting it. You also learn Kant's ethics, centered on the categorical imperative. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. You are asked to consider whether your actions would make sense if everyone did them, a test that reveals the moral logic beneath your choices. Part 4. The 19th Century, Rebellion and System. You enter the 19th century and meet Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who offers a grand vision of history as the unfolding of spirit or mind toward freedom and self-awareness. Hegel sees history as a dialectical process. Every idea or situation, thesis, generates its opposite, antithesis, and their conflict produces a new synthesis that preserves what was true in both. You learn that for Hegel, reality itself is rational, and philosophy's task is to comprehend this rationality. The state, art, religion, and philosophy are all moments in the development of spirit, and your own consciousness is a small part of this vast cosmic story. You may find Hegel difficult, even obscure, but you cannot escape his influence. Marx, existentialism, and virtually every subsequent philosophy responds to him in some way. You meet Arthur Schopenhauer, Hegel's contemporary and bitter rival, who offers a radically different vision. For Schopenhauer, the world is not rational spirit, but blind, striving will, an endless, pointless urge that manifests in everything from gravity to human desire. You learn that this will is the source of all suffering, because desire can never be finally satisfied. Fulfilling one want only creates another. Schopenhauer finds release from this suffering in art, which allows you to contemplate eternal forms free from desire, and in asceticism, which quiets the will altogether. You encounter his famous pessimism, his influence on Wagner and Nietzsche, his strange mixture of Western philosophy and Eastern thought. He leaves you with the uncomfortable suggestion that your endless striving might be not the path to happiness, but the cause of your misery. You now encounter Søren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, who rebels against Hegel's abstract system in the name of concrete individual existence. Kierkegaard argues that truth is subjectivity. What matters is not objective facts, but how you relate to them, how you live. You learn about the 3 stages on life's way: the aesthetic, where you live for pleasure and novelty; the ethical, where you commit to universal moral duties; and the religious, where you make a leap of faith beyond reason. Kierkegaard uses the story of Abraham and Isaac to explore this leap. Abraham must be willing to murder his son because God commands it, an act that makes no sense within ethics but expresses absolute faith. You are asked to consider whether such faith is madness or the highest human possibility, and whether your own life is lived aesthetically, ethically, or religiously. You meet Friedrich Nietzsche, perhaps philosophy's most dangerous and intoxicating figure, who announces the death of God and the arrival of new possibilities. Nietzsche argues that Western morality, especially Christianity, is a slave morality that resents the strong and glorifies the weak. You learn about the will to power, the fundamental drive not just to survive, but to grow, to overcome, to create. Nietzsche gives you the Übermensch, the overman who creates his own values beyond good and evil, and the eternal recurrence, the thought that you must live your life over and over infinitely. You are asked whether you can embrace this thought, whether your life is something you would choose to repeat eternally. Nietzsche does not offer comfort. He offers challenge, demanding that you become who you are. Part 5. The 20th Century, Language, Existence, and Beyond. You enter the 20th century and meet phenomenology through Edmund Husserl, who argues that philosophy must return to the things themselves. Phenomenology is the careful description of experience as it actually appears to consciousness. Setting aside assumptions about what exists independently, you learn to bracket the natural attitude, to focus on how things show up in your experience rather than on whether they are real. This method will influence everything that follows: existentialism, hermeneutics, even cognitive science. Husserl gives you a tool for paying attention to experience itself, for noticing how consciousness constitutes meaning, for doing philosophy as rigorous description rather than abstract theorizing. You meet Martin Heidegger, Husserl's most famous student, who asks the question that he believes philosophy has forgotten: what does it mean to be? Heidegger argues that you are not just a consciousness floating in a void, but a being in the world, always already engaged with things and others. You learn about Dasein, his term for the kind of being you are, and about thrownness, projection, and fallenness, the structures of your existence. Heidegger introduces you to being toward death, the recognition that your death is your own most possibility, the one thing no one else can do for you. Authenticity means facing this mortality and choosing your life in full awareness of its finitude. You may find Heidegger difficult, even troubling given his politics, but you cannot deny that he changes how you think about what it means to exist. You now encounter Jean-Paul Sartre, who popularizes existentialism and makes it a movement. Sartre announces that existence precedes essence. You are not born with a fixed nature, but create yourself through your choices. You learn about radical freedom, the burden of having to choose without any external guidance, and about bad faith, the attempt to escape this freedom by pretending you have no choice. Sartre gives you dramatic images of the human condition: the waiter who plays at being a waiter, the coward who pretends he cannot help being afraid, the lover who demands commitment while remaining free. You are left with the responsibility of creating your own values, of inventing yourself without excuse, of facing the anguish of absolute freedom. You meet Albert Camus, who explores the theme of absurdity, the collision between the human demand for meaning and the universe's silent indifference. Camus asks whether suicide is the only serious philosophical problem, and he answers with a defiant no. You learn about Sisyphus, condemned to roll a boulder up a hill, only to watch it fall forever, and Camus invites you to imagine Sisyphus happy. The absurd person lives with full awareness of meaninglessness yet continues to live, to rebel, to create. Camus distinguishes himself from Sartre and the existentialists, preferring the label absurdist. But you see the family resemblance. Both are grappling with how to live without God, without cosmic meaning, without any guarantee that your efforts matter. You turn to the analytic tradition, which dominates philosophy in the English-speaking world. Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore rebel against Hegelian idealism, arguing for clarity, logic, and common sense. You meet Ludwig Wittgenstein, who writes two completely different philosophies in his lifetime. The early Wittgenstein, in the Tractatus, argues that language pictures reality, and that most philosophy arises from misunderstanding language. The later Wittgenstein, in the Philosophical Investigations, abandons this view for a vision of language as a collection of language games, each with its own rules and meaning as use. You learn that philosophical problems are not problems to be solved, but puzzles to be dissolved by attending to how language actually works. Wittgenstein does not give you answers. He gives you therapy for the confusion that philosophy itself creates. You encounter the legacy of 20th century philosophy in all its diversity. Existentialism flows into feminism, post-colonialism, and critical theory. Phenomenology becomes hermeneutics through Hans-Georg Gadamer and Paul Ricoeur. Structuralism and post-structuralism, through figures like Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida, challenge your assumptions about knowledge, power, and meaning. Foucault shows you how knowledge is entangled with power, how the very categories you use to think are products of historical forces. Derrida gives you deconstruction, a way of reading that reveals the hidden assumptions and contradictions in any text. You may find these thinkers difficult, even frustrating, but they ask essential questions. Who gets to decide what counts as knowledge? Whose stories are told, and whose are silenced? How do you think outside the categories your culture gives you? The conversation continues, and you are now part of it. To show love and appreciation, like, share, and subscribe.